Hey, this is chapter 12 on the art of public speaking, chapter 12. And this chapter is on using language. So we're going to go forward to this. The first thing to think about when we're talking about language is the meaning of words. Words have two different meanings. There is the denotative meaning. That is the dictionary meaning, which you find in the dictionary, the precise definition as it is supposed to be. The second kind of meaning is called connotative meaning. The connotative meaning is more variable, it's more subjective. Oftentimes, the connotative meaning gives words a certain intensity or emotional power. Most of the time, the connotative meaning comes from the culture in which it's being used. So if you're wanting to remember the denotative meaning and the connotative meaning and how to get that right on the test when you're taking a test, remember this: D equals D and C equals C. Denotative equals dictionary, connotative equals culture. If you remember cultural, if you remember those two things, then it will help you out later, even when you're using the words, making sure you use them more precisely, also possibly for a test later on. Talks about using language accurately. You want to make sure that you don't use language that can confuse people. You want to make sure that we are very careful about times where we say things in a way that's not exactly accurate. The more accurate you are in what it is you say, the more clearly people will understand you. So you want to use language accurately. You want to use language clearly. Talks about using familiar words. That helps us, actually brings us in. Words with which you're familiar, words with which we are familiar. It clears things up for us. It's best to use at times. Of course, there's a time for abstract words, but a lot of times the best thing to use are concrete words, words that give us a clear picture of what it is you're saying. Going forward in this, just an example real briefly on concrete words versus abstract words. If you think about sports, so someone is an athlete. Well, someone is an NBA player. Someone is a basketball player. Someone is an NBA player. Then you might mention a specific name, such as LeBron James, or someone along that line. Now we have a very concrete picture versus just an athlete or a professional athlete. Eliminate clutter. When possible, say it in as few words, especially public speaking, say it in as few words as possible. Take out phrases that are just adding something to the words that you're using that are not helping, and they sometimes will be part of what makes things unclear. Talks about using language vividly. There are a lot of different ways you can use language vividly. You can create imagery, create a picture. You do that typically through using concrete words is one way to do it. Another way to do it is use simile. That's where you use the word like or as to compare one thing to another. If you say, well, he or she was tall as a tree, that's a simile. If you take the like or as out, then it's a metaphor. He or she was a tree. The next section on that is creating rhythm. Rhythm is it can really make something very powerful. If you think about the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, he has a very powerful way of creating rhythm. He does it through certain speech patterns that are created, an arrangement of words that creates a flow, almost like a rhythmic flow of the waves beating on the sand, and it just goes forward in a very rhythmic way. You can do that through parallelism. You have a similar arrangement of a pair of words or a series of related words. The book has an example of rich and poor, intelligent and ignorant, wise and foolish. That's one way to create parallelism. You can use repetition. In Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, he repeated that phrase a number of times. I have a dream that one day this will happen. I have a dream that one day that will happen. You can use alliteration. And also the book mentions you can use antithesis. Alliteration, of course, is the repetition of an initial sound of a word in several words in a row. Antithesis is the combination of opposing elements. One of the great examples of this is from the I Have a Dream speech, in which he combines both alliteration and antithesis in the same sentence. He says, I have a dream that one day my little girls will live in a country where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. There's that alliteration with the k sound. And of course, being judged by the color of your skin is the antithesis of being judged by the content of your character. Talks about using language appropriately. And this is very, very important. You want to use language appropriate to the occasion. I've always wanted to tell a joke at a funeral, but I never have. You want to use language that's appropriate to the audience. You have to be aware that the language we use in everyday life oftentimes creeps into our public speaking and it's not appropriate. I've actually had students who accidentally use the F word in class and they immediately turned to me and went, sorry. You have to understand this. And if we want to talk about it from an interpersonal communication standpoint, the language that we use as we go through our life, as we grow up and as we get into adulthood, you have to be aware that whatever language you're using is going to creep up and your kids are going to hear it and the kids are going to repeat it. That's something you need to be very aware of. It needs to be appropriate to the topic. There are topics that are more complex and there's a certain language that goes with that. It also needs to be appropriate to the speaker. Don't speak in a way that's not comfortable for you. Don't speak in a way where you're trying to sort of fit in with the audience maybe, or speak in a way that's just not natural for you. That's not a good thing to do. Book talks about a note on inclusive language. It says avoid the generic he. You may have already noticed, and if you've listened to my first lectures, you may have already noticed how many times I say he or she or he. So I try to avoid the generic he. Avoid the use of man when referring to both men and women. We don't say policeman, we say police officer. My mom, back in the late 1950s, was one of the first two police officer women who were police officers in the Birmingham Police Department. My dad had that article on his wall for years. Avoid stereotyping jobs and social roles by gender. There are men who stay home to raise their children. Absolutely. So don't be stereotyping things. You don't use the term businessman. A business person is more appropriate. Use names that groups use to identify themselves. And this is one of those situations where you have to think about what a group wants to be called and honor that by paying attention to it and using those terms that are appropriate for that group. And that's the end of the chapter on language in the art of public speaking.